And I was left thinking, you really didn't mean to write that, did you? Because yeah, I mean, first of all, you think about Adorno's critique of authenticity and the jargon of authenticity, and I started thinking to myself, maybe the beauty and the terror of psychoanalysis is that in a way there is no such thing as authentic experience.
I'm going to start off by handing over to Ann and Avgi, and maybe if you can talk a little bit about the book and some of the ideas and how it came together.
Thank you, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be part of today's conversation. Thank you for all the work you've done setting up the possibility of again, I think we're going to really dig into some important questions. So Avgi and I thought we'd begin by just sort of framing a little bit about the argument or main arguments of our book, and in particular, the kinds of conversations we're trying to intervene in. I should say up front that we're both psychoanalysts. I'm also a full-time faculty member at New York University. So the book is both, it's an offering to clinicians, but we also hope it's the kinds of arguments we're making will be legible. We've wrote it in a way that we hope is quite legible for other kinds of readers in the university and outside as well. And this is in part because we're meaning to speak to debates happening within psychoanalysis, as well as broader debates. And psychoanalysis is not apart from the broader culture. So some of these broader and actually often really currently quite virulent debates about trans life, especially transgender children. Of course, this is roiling psychoanalysis as well, because psychoanalysis is not apart from the broader culture, right? So that's just a few preliminary things to say. So what is the main argument or arguments of the book? Avgi and I have been noticing, we're hardly alone in noticing, that in the midst of what are attacks on trans life in the United States, in Britain and Australia and elsewhere, we seem to be hearing two different kinds of arguments. I'm going to think broadly about cultural political arguments. There's those who are, let's say, anxious about, opposed to trans life, and especially the phenomenon of trans children, will say some version of the following: that those children who believe themselves to be trans are mistaken, and that maybe they are in the grip of some kind of trauma or some other kind of psychopathology. And if you treat that trauma, if you treat that psychopathology, you will address their belief, their false belief that they're actually trans. So again, here there's a sense in which transness is seen as a kind of warping of what should otherwise be, basically a kind of binary gender, cisgender, to use another terminology, right? And as against the claim that trans people have been warped that way, have come mistakenly to believe they're trans, it has seemed as if the only possible counter is to say that just like cisgender people, those people who are normatively gendered, and I know we're going to talk about even the fantasy of normative gender, right? Just like people who are normatively gendered or cisgendered were born that way, so too are trans people born that way, or other kind of genderqueer people born that way. And this, again, has seemed like the only possible counter to the, quite frankly, genocidal attack on trans life that Warped That Way promotes, right? So that's a broader cultural political debate. And just to say, I'm speaking to you from the United States. Last year, in 2023, there were more than 500 pieces of legislation introduced into state legislatures across the United States, attacking LGBTQ people, a large share focusing on transness and trans children in particular. This year, we're not even 2 months into 2024, already hundreds of pieces of legislation, again, going after LGBTQ people, a lot focusing on transgender people, on trans kids in particular. So this is not a minor background, right? How does psychoanalysis fit in here? Again, as I said, psychoanalysis is not apart from the broader culture. It too is actually being roiled by debates over the question of transness. And it also has been sort of like split versus a kind of, there's the affirmative model. You affirm gender difference, transness, non-binary, as being as neutral as normative gender, or a real strong promotion of the warped that way psychopathological. And for those who wish to affirm trans life and queer life, there's a falling back on the concept of core gender identity, a term that we inherit from Robert Stoller from 1964. Avgi and I think that this is an inadequate framing of the debate, and we're deeply concerned about how advocates for LGBTQ life inside and outside psychoanalysis have felt as if we've had to rely on the notion of core gender identity, on immutability, to argue for, to promote trans and queer flourishing. So in this book, we offer a quite different model. And this model also fundamentally involves rethinking the relationship between gender and trauma. And I want to hand this off to Avgi, because our thinking about a new relationship between gender and trauma was made possible by a line of argument she developed in her book, Sexuality Beyond Consent.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you very much, Michael and Yvonne, for making this happen, and Barnaby for participating in this conversation again. And thank you all for spending a couple of hours with us this afternoon. So to pick up from where Anne left off, like one of the things that, I'm a psychoanalyst and psychologist working in New York City, and I've been working with trans and queer patients for over 20 years, including trans children. And one of the things that feels like a gaping hole in our theorizing, psychoanalytic theorizing, is not quite having psychoanalytic models with which to think gender diversity. In other words, there's been either the very flattened out ways of understanding trans life, as Anne was saying, where it is seen as a departure from normal and healthy gender, which is seen as always cis, binary, and in keeping with birth assignment at birth, or some just encompassing, and I'm going to explain why I put this in quotes, encompassing version of, well, there's cis people and trans people, and there's nothing to see here about gender. But one of the things that we became very clear about actually in working on this book is that psychoanalysis has always been preoccupied and always been able to think with how people, how the density of people's gender acquires its texture, how it is that, for example, cis women become the cis women that they are. So we think with identification and counter-identification and a series of psychic processes that seek to give us a way into how somebody experiences their gender. But this is not something that we do with trans or genderqueer people, except as a way of critiquing or raising concerns or even an alarm for their gender constitution. So in some ways, we have wanted to offer and think about theory that gives us a way of entering that conversation psychoanalytically. In this debate that Anne was describing between the Born This Way argument, which basically refers to, from a psychoanalytic perspective, harkens back to a notion of like the core gender identity, which is Stoller's contribution to the literature. And the Walk This Way, the idea that trauma or some psychic experience has caused somebody to deviate from a healthy gender as assigned at birth, we have also two very large camps of thinking psychoanalytically on how to work with gender diverse people. The one is, as Anne was saying, try to cure whatever made them trans. And the other is to just, the notion, or at least the fantasy, that some people are just affirming trans people's genders without doing any work. And what we wanted to say in response to that is that they are both largely inadequate. And in fact, even the idea that some people work only to affirm a patient's gender without doing anything else may itself be kind of like a misunderstanding of how those of us who work affirmatively work. And we go into a deep dive in the book of how one might work in a way that is affirmative, but without that being kind of like the end of the line, that being the starting point in doing clinical work, but not where the clinical work stops when it comes to trans and queer patients. And key to this theorization is the notion of traumatophilia that we worked with in this book, and which Barnaby and I were touching on in our discussion of my book in our previous meeting, which is the idea that, based on Laplanche's theory, and perhaps we'll go into kind of like more detail as the conversation proceeds. Based on Laplanche's theory, we work with the idea that we work with his concept that there are various responses that the psyche can generate in trying to engage with trauma. And I use the word engage here because I want to underline from the get-go how preoccupied we are, or kind of like overconfident, that the way that what the psyche does with trauma is try to cope with it or try to process it. Engagement is a different way of thinking about how, in the aftermath of a traumatic encounter, be that the small normative and constitutively founding trauma of implantation, or capital T, episodic, circumscribed traumatic events. In response to that, the psyche is forced to respond. And how and what kinds of psychic products are secreted in the response to that trauma has to do with it's critical to the question of psychic autonomy, on the question of how one kind of like self-theorizes, as Laplanche uses it, which is another way of talking about how one self-mythologizes. The self-theorization of all of us comes from places that we do not exactly command, and yet that nevertheless are ours. I know that this may be sounding very theoretical and very kind of like abstract at the moment, but I hope that very soon, perhaps in talking about the clinical case that we discuss in the book, we can get into some of that more closely, more in depth. And in the discussion of the case in the book, which is of a 12-year-old gender diverse child who is assigned male at birth and whose gender has become a problem for their family. The child's gender is too feminine, the parents feel, is too dangerous for the family and the social milieu. So we talk about this case to track how the intergenerational transmission of trauma can become itself a translational code for the crafting of various aspects of the self, and what the ethical and clinical implications are of that. So I'll stop here. There's so much more to say, but I'll stop here for now.
Maybe one more thing I'll add, and this has to do with the materials we draw on in the book. Again, as I said, we're both, practicing psychoanalysts. Both of us work with a lot of queer and trans people. We're both members of the queer community. We're very invested in queer and trans flourishing. We're very, sort of paying a lot of attention to the political questions as they are swirling about in numerous national contexts. And we also read widely in queer and trans theories. also, again, I'm a full-time university professor. So we're drawing on materials from outside psychoanalysis and bringing them into psychoanalysis to help us think about gender differently, to help us, basically cope with what appears to many psychoanalysts to be the new strangeness in the room. We want to make psychoanalysis actually strange to itself and sort of open it up to how to think about the social differently. And in particular, basically the new genders that are in our midst, many of which have been with us for a long time, but psychoanalysis, unfortunately, has not always done a great job of thinking about. So we do, this book is also basically trying to shake up psychoanalysis, because we think it needs to do a much better job at thinking about queerness and transness, because queer and trans people are already in the room. And queer and trans people are also already practicing psychoanalysts, right? Our institutes need to do a much better job of dealing with these questions and doing a lot of self-reflection.
The case that you had, I thought was quite amazing, and actually very relatable too, which I think is part of for me. I found the appeal of that first paper, and I think so. I don't know if you want to give a few details on the case, but it was relatable too, also because here in South Africa, we also have some religious Orthodox communities, but also some quite I'm not sure what the word is, sort of Christian communities that are I suppose very unqueer, trans friendly, where and sometimes a lot of people, what I found that I get, and adolescents come in with a real conflict between these two parts. So I don't know if you could want to say a bit about the case. Yeah.
I can describe the case a little bit, and perhaps Ann, you can also jump in and speak a little bit about the religious piece. So this was a 12-year-old child that I treated, and they were brought to me by their parents, who were quite frustrated and actually quite anxious about the child's feminine kind of like comportment, their gestures, their way of speaking. And it was clear from the get-go that what the parents wanted was for me to help the child be more masculine and perhaps also be straight. Like, it was the conversation about whether this child was gay or proto-trans, or what exactly was going on with their gender and their sexuality, was very much swirling in the family system, and quite a concern for the community that this child was living in. And by the time I saw this child, so much had happened around their gender. There was so much policing of their gestures, so many family fights around who's protecting them in the family and who is. In fact, the father was extremely critical of the child, and the mother was also very concerned about their gender, but also concerned about the impact that the father's interventions had on their relationship, on the family. She was also concerned about how the grandparents would treat that, and how the larger social media would respond to the child, but also to the family as having been in some way negatively marked by their child's gender diversity. So it took a while for the parents to actually allow themselves to bring their child to me. We met, and it was very clear that they were vetting me. And I probably met with them for around 3 months, mostly with the mother, before the child was brought in to see me, even as the treatment was from the beginning framed as being a child treatment. Once the child came to see me, we call him Ori in the book, and I'm going to move between he, him, and they, them pronouns for this child, partly because at the time of the treatment, the child was using for themselves he, him pronouns, and yet it was clear that nothing else would be acceptable in the family, and I have no way of knowing how this child's gender has developed. So when I use they, them, I do that as a way of keeping open the prospect that something about their gender might have evolved in some way that is unknown to us. And I think that that unknowability is very important. In other words, I'm not using they, them as a way of claiming that I know something about their gender, but as an effort to keep something more open. So when they first came to see me, they were extremely reserved and very polite, very well-mannered, and very interested in orienting themselves around what would please me. So it took quite a bit of time, especially for a child that is 12 years old, for something new to happen. And there were awkward silences. I tried to engage them. They were, it was clear that the concern that they had about how they're being seen was now also transferentially in the room with me. And something shifted around the time that the child, like for the first time, Ori left their hands just go from a clasped position to just touching the couch. And I noticed that they were kind of like feeling the fabric of the couch. And I said something to them about kind of like the sensation on the couch. And they started talking, all of a sudden opened up and started talking, kind of like through the haptic, something opens up. And they start talking about the sensation of things on their skin. They start kind of like talking about fabrics, and they start in a very delightful and unexpected way instructing me to move around the room with them and touch different objects and feel together the sensation of different kinds of surfaces in the room. And that really opens up something. And we spent the next few sessions with them doing all kinds of things, about beginning to talk to me about even a collection of fabrics that they have at home, which they're very anxious their parents will find out they have. And their sensuous relationship with these fabrics, with the type of movement, begins to take up a lot of time and space in our sessions. And then at some point, they revealed to me that they actually have a deep love of orchids, and I invite them to, I suggest, why don't we get an orchid that we care for together? And they say to me, how? And I say, well, why don't we go online and pick one? So we go online, we find an orchid together, I order it, and when they come into the room the next time, the orchid is there and they are absolutely delighted. They want to advise me as to where to place it, how to water it. And it turns out that they're actually quite an orchid expert, which I had no idea about. And it turns out that they spend a lot of their time on the internet researching orchids, which I think is quite a curious and unusual preoccupation for a 12-year-old. And, you know, like in this form of like play and twined engagement, bodily engagement, sensory engagement, the orchid becomes really important. And yet in the very first time that they walk in, they see the orchid, we start talking about that. I also ask my patient in a way that at the time feels entirely naive, like I was not intending this as an intervention. It just came out of me and I heard myself say it. The orchid that ended up in my office had two stems. One of them was kind of like supported by one of those clips and the plastic rods that kind of like hold these plants up. And there was another one that was slightly bent to the side. And I asked them as they were describing to me how to water it and sun and not to touch it and how to inspect its health. I said to them, what do we do about the bent, unsupported stem? And then all of a sudden, you know how like when you're in a sunny day and a cloud passes through and suddenly everything changes? Like something really changed in the room. And I realized that perhaps whether on some level I was intending this as an intervention or not, it certainly meant something to them. And then he looked at me and he said, you know, my mother bought me an orchid and she tried to fix the bent stem and she broke it and then the plant died. And that feels like a very particular moment because it's the first time that he's talking to me about the family, referencing their family life. And I say, in a way that felt like a very small step in the moment, I said to them, it sounds like it felt to your mother that there was something wrong with the bent stem. and that she wanted to fix it. But it sounds like it was just beautiful, just as it was. And he looks at me, he makes eye contact for the first time. They leave the session, they say goodbye for the first time, and then he never comes to see me again. He says to his mother that the treatment is not useful. And then the rest of the case is the mother asking me if she can meet with me so that we can discuss parenting. And in the hopes that that can happen, I start to meet with her, and then a bunch of things happen in those encounters. But this is the case, which is in some ways we might say it's a prematurely terminated case. And we might say it's also like a failed case in the sense that, you know, the kinds of things that one would hope I would be able to address with him don't get really unfurled. And yet we use this material to argue that, to make some arguments and think through about questions of religion, given that the child is in the context of a very Orthodox Jewish family. And the mother, when she starts meeting with me, found out all the ways in which the child's gender is a problem for, also from a religious perspective. And maybe, Anne, maybe you would pick up from here.
Sure. I mean, so as Avgi mentioned, this child came from an Orthodox Jewish family. You know, one of the things that was made very clear to Avgi very early on, before she'd even met with Ori, the name that this child has is given in the case. Even before Avgi got to meet with Ori, it was made very clear that were this child to turn out to be gay, they would not be welcome in the house any longer. And not, I think at some point, Aaron, the father, whom we call Aaron, and not, you know, sort of in a few years, but immediately. So, you know, Avgi also knew the stakes of this work were very high, that if in working with this child to help the child become in whatever direction might be happening, was actually putting at potential risk the child's security within their family. So again, very high stakes. And, you know, part of the parental objections, especially as voiced by the father, were framed in religious terms. And this is where I do want to make the following very strong point, which is that, to be sure, numerous religions, and here in no way is Judaism singular, and also actually Judaism is not singular in lots of ways. There are Judaisms plural, right? There are multiple branches of Judaism, but you know, yes, there are homophobic and transphobic strains within Judaisms, as within Christianities, as within Islams. But religion is not in and of itself transphobic or homophobic, right? Religion is what people make of it and with it, right? And moreover, there are Orthodox organizations, Jewish Orthodox organizations in the United States, that are also seeking to make room for LGBTQ people. So in no way in looking at the homotransphobia of this particular Orthodox Jewish family, are we making any claims about Jewish orthodoxy across the board. So I think that's just very important to say. And it's also, I think, important to say, because of the secularism or the secular, let's say, pretensions of psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud was deeply invested in producing psychoanalysis as a secular science and very worried. This is because he knew intimately what it was to experience anti-Semitism, certainly deeply concerned about the ways in which psychoanalysis was being marked as a Jewish science. So he really doubled down on what was already his hostility to religion, uppercase R, and wanting to make psychoanalysis out in the sort of image of science, right? And I think that that psychoanalysis is still in the grip of this. In some sense, this is really paradoxical. We're in the grip of a kind of secular story that emphasizes rationalism and the scientific, even as the stuff of psychoanalysis is actually not the rational. So there's a tension within psychoanalysis, given its own secular history again, which is also about, you know, again, the violence of anti-Semitism and trying to sort of fight anti-Semitism. But it also means that psychoanalysis, I think, is not always so well equipped to listen to listen for the religious materials, the religious strains that are in the room with us, because so many of the people we work with might come from a religious background, and we might not always know what to do with that. So I think one of our interests in this, in thinking about Ori, is also sort of really trying to get psychoanalysts to pay attention to religion differently, And maybe this is the other point I'll make, that and this is about secularism more broadly. I think secular subjects, we are the civilized, rational subjects of modernity, and religion, that's where irrationality lies. That's where the violence of political strife comes from. And so we can sometimes, it's not like secularism. Okay, secularism has a lot of blood in its hands. Just look at the wars of the 20th century, let alone the 21st, right? But I think secular subjects often like to say, oh, homotransphobia, that's a religious problem, right? And we know, and unfortunately we know this from within psychoanalysis, there are a lot of analysts who are actually doing active harm to trans and queer people, and are doing so using psychoanalytic concepts that they understand to be secular and based in science, right? So I just say this is not a religion versus secularism issue, right? So again, sorry, lots of background, but I think it's important because of the stereotypes with which I think sometimes religion, especially, so religion is regarded and seen as necessarily conservative when it's not. One of the things to go focus in specifically on the case of Ori and the Orthodox Jewish world that Ori comes from is thinking about the history of and some of this is about the imprint of anti-Semitism on how Jewish gender and sexuality was stereotyped and imagined, right? The anti-Semitic imaginary of that, but also through the density of practices that have developed within Judaism's and Jewish cultures in a plural sense, that we really wanted to pay attention to the ways in which Jewishness and gender were braided together, right? That religion was inflecting how gender was a kind of having a kind of density. It also was inflecting what kinds of gender were possible, right? And there's really exciting work that's happening in Jewish cultural studies that's been thinking about Jewishness and gender together, for a while. And we wanted to make that resource, bring that resource into thinking about how different kinds of masculinity were actually possible, even as I think these were also presenting some anxiety for the parents.
I've got a couple of thoughts at the moment. The one is I suppose that moment with the case with the touching and the texture, so beautiful, I thought, but then there's other interesting thing happens with the mother, which was very interesting in terms of what would you call it, the enigmatic messages, I suppose, that sort of come through. So that's my one.
Would you like me to say?
Yeah. So
would you like me to say something about that?
Yes. I also wouldn't mind at some point there was some interesting thing about whiteness, which I thought was very interesting, but I think that comes later on in terms of the assumptions that happen there in terms of with gender. So I thought that's it. But maybe if you could say a bit about the mother, and then let's see if we can bring Barnaby in also.
Okay. Well, the mother, once the mother starts meeting with me, it becomes clear that there is a lineage of what we describe as gender trouble in the family that the mother is also anxious about. Though gender trouble in the mother's case is not so much about whether she was gay or trans or anything of the kind, but about how patriarchy and sexism play out through the family, through the generations, and how it turns out in my meetings with her that around the same age that Ori is going through this kind of heightened attention on their gender, and it so happens that their older brother actually has also gone through a heightened attention at the same age. That is the same age that the mother had when she was young, began to question her religion. And I become curious about that in the treatment because of this coincidence in time, which I find to be meaningful. And here is part of our theoretical intervention, which has less now to do with the case and more to do with what we want to add to psychoanalytic thinking, especially Laplanchian thinking around the enigmatic, is it would be easy and tempting to take the material that the mother offers me as part of her history and wonder how that has now sedimented into the child, such that it has produced a relationship with normativity that now runs through gender rather than religion for Ori. In other words, it would be easy for somebody to say, like when she was 12, she was struggling with her religion. Was she going to stay in Judaism or not? How would her family receive that? And isn't there a parallel with what is happening around the child's gender? And could the child's gender be the site where the expression of the mother's and the transmission of the mother's ambivalence about her religion take a shape into the child, so that the child is tasked in an intergenerational way with carrying something from the mother? And this is one way in which variant genders have been understood, as a distortion that is tasked to the child by the parent's history. So the parent has some unresolved trauma, some unresolved dynamic that then gets like sediments into the child's psyche and then gets expressed as symptom in the child. And we take very seriously the possible connection between the mother's anguish and what her questioning about her religion and what that means in terms of her relationships with her objects, what it means in terms of like the sexual, like what does it mean for a 12-year-old at the time of 12-year-old girl coming from a conservative community, especially around ideas around gender and sexuality, to begin to wonder if she will stay in that community or not. Would she disappoint? What about her own autonomy, her own separateness? We want to take that seriously, but without collapsing it into what to us feels like a collapse, into that becoming Ori's symptom, but to wonder if that becomes a code, translational code, through which Ori will then translate their own gender, such that the parent's history is absolutely part of the psychic secretion of the work of the unconscious, turned into like whatever expression of gender Ori has now, but not as a distortion, but actually as a part of an exercise of whatever psychic autonomy we have when it comes to translation. And that is the most critical, in our view, intervention of the book, to make, when it comes to psychoanalytic theory, to argue that there's a way to think about the intergenerational transmission as being related, but not as a distortion or a deviation from what would have been naturally Ori's gender, but as a way of taking very seriously how the psychic life of the parent gets folded into the child, but how it gets folded into, and whether the child gets to have some relative freedom in their translation and then get to have their translations be supported and affirmed. That's where affirmation comes in. That might be a different way to think about it, rather than as a botched project of where the parent interferes with the child's true authentic self.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that is, I think, well, there's a couple of other, I think, big contributions, but I think that is the very important one, and certainly had me thinking in terms of a couple of patients I've worked with. So the one part is how important is the transgenerational pass down through the enigmatic messages. But the other part that I thought was so wonderful was the thought that we're not looking at something pathological. So we're not saying that this is some, like when one talks about transgenerational trauma and there's this bad thing that's happened and it's now been unconsciously passed to this child who now carries it as a symptom that needs to be got rid of. And I thought that was actually very important. And I don't know if you would like to talk about that, because that I suppose that then gets, I think, into I think the point also when you linked in whiteness, and which I thought was wonderful. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, one thing I was just maybe say quickly as a response to what you just brought up, Michael, is that one of the claims we're making is that the intergenerational transmission here between the mother and the child, the intergenerational transmission even of trauma, if we think about this as simply as something that is done to Ori, something put into him, then whatever Ori comes to do with that material seems like it's actually a swerving away from, a warping of who he otherwise would have grown to be, right? It's a traumatic destruction of something. But if we think about an intergenerational transmission as also being that the trauma becomes something that Ori can do something with themselves, I'm also moving back and forth between the he and they, so as to soften any notion that we are making strong identity claims about we know who Ori is, right? If we think about the trauma as something Ori can do something with himself and improvising with it, it becomes some of the materials that Ori will then use to make sense of the enigmatic transmission in a Laplanchian sense. And we might want to talk a little bit about the complicated relation between what Laplanche means by enigmatic transmission and what many psychoanalysts have come to talk about as intergenerational transmission of trauma, right? That one of the things we're arguing is that trauma can actually become material that could be part of the reformatting, something that a subject does something with. Again, not just a flat imposition that destroys you, but something that provides an energy to do something with. And we're also, specifically in the case of Ori, interested about how that intergenerational transmission is also maybe going to, sort of is caught up also with histories of anti-Semitism, some of which get sedimented around sexuality and gender, such that there's a profound and profoundly genocidal history in European sciences of anti-Semitism that sort of picture sort of Jewish racialized difference as being about queer gender and queer sexuality, especially for Jewish men. So that one of the profound ironies of Ori's situation is that some of the things that drove the parents to distraction that really upset the parents, the gesticulation of Ori's arms, the sing-song voice that the parents hated, these were also taken to be some of the signs of Jewish male difference, and again, within anti-Semitic discourses. So there's something really fascinating about some of what the parents are responding to are anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jewish masculinity, right? Which is also was queered within a kind of Christian secular imagination, and queered in a bad way. So there's also, we're thinking about the swirl of what's handed to Ori that Ori can draw onto format also is, this really complex braid between Jewishness and gender as well.
I think where I would like to go, following along the line we're going now, is to sort of get it into, well, I've got, as I said, I've got a interest in that bit where you spoke about whiteness, because I think that's so clever and apt. And I'm really wanting to also get into what the politics around the book, and to think about why it is and I don't know all of them. I think Barnaby and the two of you know more about it, but when I read it, it just felt like such an important ideas to be put out. So I sort of I'm sort of curious what that means psychoanalytically, that there is that pushback, and I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about that in terms of what happened with the book, with the publication, especially seeing that paper won an award. It was something to be celebrated. And now, Barnaby, we've got you back. I think you had a few, I think 3 particular questions or thoughts that you wanted to put out.
I actually wonder if the two of you anticipated how much resistance I believe you're going to get to this book. Because, I'm now going to be somewhat snide, but outside of New York, I think this is pathbreaking. And I think you've done a pioneering job of exploring I was going to say the genesis of gender, but since you have a very cogent critique of etiological thinking, I'll use some other word. And I'm wondering if you both realize how unfamiliar this is to such a high percentage of psychoanalysts. Because, I've been a psychoanalyst in Detroit and in India, and now in South Africa, where we have quite liberal laws around transgendering, but we also have a huge record of transphobic violence. It's a paradoxical culture we live in. So I'd like to say a couple of things about what I think are the virtues of this book, because I think, and I really wonder if you realized how much you're on the cutting edge. I mean, and maybe if you practice in Manhattan, you're not on the cutting edge. I don't know, but you seem to me to be doing a remarkable pioneering job of helping us understand in a way that there's no normal thing as gender, by which I mean that gender comes to us traumatized, whether our sense of our gender is normative or our sense of our gender is non-normative, it comes to us via trauma. That's amazing. And your critique of core gender identity, I think, is hugely important, as well as the critique of developmentalism and etiological thinking that in some sense goes along with that. Because I think that most of us, even as psychoanalysts, come back to the idea that boys are boys and girls are girls, and that's really some sort of a bedrock. And then those of us who start to try to think about it a little bit more get very caught, as I believe did Freud, on the idea that the perception of anatomical difference has some sort of a primordial significance. And you do a remarkable job. It's a remarkable job, but it's also quite difficult to follow. I think for many of us not seeped in some of the theorizing that you're seeped in. You do a remarkable job of explaining how it is that, in a way, gender precedes sex. Or maybe, again, precedes is the wrong word. But that is very profound and should have, I think, for all of us who see psychoanalytic patients, enormously profound consequences when we sit with a patient. The idea that you can sit with a patient and you cannot think and should not think of it and gender in terms of any sort of a binarism, because gender is indeed polymorphic. But beyond being polymorphic, it seems to me you make a strong case that it's propositional and provisional. And that's incredible, because too many of us sit with a patient whose manifest gender identity is this or that, and we sort of think that that's the end of the story. And it's not the end of the story. And you show that beautifully, although in some ways I don't think you highlight it enough, highlighted sufficiently in the book. Then we get to the idea that our sense of gender is always as a result of trauma. And you lean, of course, heavily on Laplanche's notion of this early trauma with the imposition and implantation of enigmatic messages and what that means. And in a way, this leans heavily on Laplanche's notion of the fundamental anthropological situation and the general seduction theory, that we have a trauma, and out of that trauma comes our sense of gender. And then, now, and I think this is something I would like to challenge you further on, but I'd also like to give a quote from your book. This is one of my favorite quotes. Gender, all gender, is both delightfully stranger and more savagely violent than our theorists can imagine. And I think you've made an enormous contribution to the psychoanalytic literature by explaining to us both those parts of that sentence, that our gender is actually delightfully stranger for all of us, not just for people who think of themselves as non-binary or trans. That challenges all of us to really dig deeper in the analytic situation with patients who think that they're a boy or a girl, and that's that. It's not in any way to be called into question or to be subjected to analysis. So that was one of my favorite quotes. You say and you argue that one treats trauma, one treats this early traumatization around genderization by self-theorization. And the thing that I really want to challenge you on is I find that your discussion of self-theorization quite confusing. So I can explain more why I'm confused, but I think, Avgi, we should go to you, and you should respond. You and Anne should respond to what I've said thus far as you see warranted.
There's so much to say about what you said. Thank you. I'm just going to say like a couple of things. First of all, we had not talked until you made your comments about how the argument that you're making is indeed about all people. It's not just about genders that are trans or genders that are non-normative. Our argument is indeed that all not only is all gender a result of kind of a psychic production that follows on the heels of trauma and in response to trauma, but also that all gender is acquired. And as you were saying, Barnaby, that it is, you said, like, it's experimental and provisional. It's an improvisation. Like, gender is in some ways a made-up thing, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have material consequences or psychic heft. It just means that there's nothing true or untrue about one's gender, and hence, kind of like, we need different modalities with which to think with gender, moving away from the notion of whether something is accurate or inaccurate, which is kind of like a particular framework that is now kind of like torturing trans people. Like, you know, analysts, clinicians are asked all the time to determine if somebody's really trans or not really trans, which comes precisely from this idea of gender as having to do with truth. But, you know, and the idea that it's not the end of the story, like gender is not the end of the story. Like, I think that in a practice of radical psychoanalysis, we treat nothing as the end of the story, and yet some genders are treated as the end of the story, and that's part of what we wanted to illuminate. So I'm very glad that that comes across and that it speaks to you. In terms of the resistance, maybe Anne, we can also say a little bit about how this book came about. But what I will quickly say now is that we expected resistance, but we didn't expect resistance that was so unsophisticated, so to speak, as this one was. We expected resistance that had to do with different forms of engagement around our book. We didn't expect that there was going to be effort to suppress these ideas, or to be told that we shouldn't publish them, or for efforts to be made actively to keep us from publishing them. That felt kind of like really very difficult. I'm not going to minimize that. It was a very difficult thing to deal with, and maybe Anne will say a little bit about the history. But it also felt really fascinating because it brought into focus how dangerous a conversation feels to psychoanalysis. And since it feels dangerous, it is also important because we are very interested in the dangerous places where thought can go, because without them, we're just working to solidify what we already know, and that's not going to do very much for us as clinicians or for our patients. I wanna engage separately your question about self-theorization, because that's another very important part of the book. So maybe I'll pass it to Anne, and then we can have a conversation about self-theorization and what we're doing with that and the question of agency.
Yeah. Also, thank you, Barnaby, for those comments. You know, I do want to say that I think we're aware, but not sufficiently aware of the kinds of interventions this book might be making. I think that maybe we're also still coming to understand some of the interventions the book is making. But I don't think that the things we're claiming in the book are like, basically everybody in New York knows this. And certainly, you know, one of the things we are concerned about is that we're excited at the ways in which we're hearing people taking up the arguments of the book and sort of thinking about all gender is a kind of complex becoming, thinking about the relationship between gender and trauma. We're wondering if there might be catchphrases that get pulled on without seeing that we're actually making like really strong claims about, again, how to think differently about the development of all genders as unfinished process, and to think very differently about, again, trauma and gender's relation. And I use the word development. I think you're quite right. I know you reframed from genesis of gender because of the worries about developmentalism. As you know, we make a distinction between developmentalism, which would present any, let's say, unfolding of gender as a teleology. It's going in one direction. We would be critical of developmentalism with respect to sexuality as well. But we do want to make room for thinking about development, the ways in which we change over time, including gender changes over time. And we want to give psychoanalysts the resources to think about temporality without, again, the anxiety or the hubris of thinking we know where it ends, right? So that's something. But with respect to the New Yorkness of the argument, it's definitely not, I think, we see opposition in New York as well. And certainly in the origins of what became this book, we experienced it from London. So maybe this would be useful to say a little bit about the strange origins of this little book. And it is actually a little book. We initially wrote a version of what became chapter 1. It was a case study of Avgi's, and we started working on sort of taking it apart and building it back up together, and submitted it for consideration for an essay prize. It was the first ever Tiresias paper award to be given by the International Psychoanalytical Association, by their fairly new Committee for Gender and Sexual Diversity. And that was a committee that was established in 2017. It took a lot of political work just to make that committee happen within the IPA. And they pushed, this was under the leadership of Marco Posadas, to create an essay prize. And this essay prize was going to give its first award, I believe, in actually 2021. So we submitted for that essay prize, and to our delight, our paper was selected as to get the award. And one of the possibilities that came with that award is that the committee had negotiated with the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, the oldest journal in the field. Freud was one of its founders. The committee had worked with IJP to streamline the possibility of the publication of that paper. The idea is that the paper would be submitted to the journal editors, who would make a determination about what kinds of revisions were needed, whether the paper would be acceptable for publication in the journal. So after winning the prize, we did indeed submit our paper for consideration at the IJP, and it was accepted, and we were given some revisions to make. And we spent a year working on those revisions. We were really excited to be sort of hacking at the paper some more and developing it more. There were big constraints in the essay. The essay prize, it could be no more than 10,000 words inclusive of bibliography. So we got to expand it in preparing it for a journal submission. So we worked on it for a year. Then there had been a change in editors in the meantime. We submitted it to a new editorial team at IJP. Again, it was accepted, and in writing, we were given some more revisions, which we made some changes. We got a last round of comments. We were told we didn't have to respond to them, but we were very excited by them. We asked if we could make a few more changes. They said yes. Then we finally submitted what we thought was the final version of the paper. Again, everything was sailing along. People at IGP were excited with the ideas. Again, we were told twice it was going to be published. We gave what we thought was the final.
I should add here, for whoever has not been through the submission process, that this is pretty much how submission processes work. You submit, you get comments, you send it back, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it can take a while for the revisions. So we submitted what we thought was the final version. We added acknowledgements. This is very conventional with a journal article or a book. You might have acknowledgements. So our first footnote in the paper was a set of acknowledgements. And then we also had added some more materials in the main text responding to the final round of comments. So we submitted, and then we didn't hear anything for a week, which was unusual in terms of the speed of that we become accustomed to in the communications. And when we did next hear, everything had changed. We were basically kindly asked to take 3 sentences out of the acknowledgements, to remove entirely the last addition we'd made to the main text, but we were given no reason. And it became clear that publication of the essay was now suddenly contingent on our taking these 3 sentences out of the acknowledgements and taking this new section out of the main text. But again, we were not told why this was now suddenly an issue. And I'll hand the baton back to Avgi if you want to maybe say something about what we said in those acknowledgements.
Yeah, I mean, what we said, the acknowledgements were thanking the committee for their work, Marco Posadas for putting together the award, and also welcoming queer and trans subjects into psychoanalysis, not just as patients, but also as our colleagues and our teachers and our supervisors, and also wishing that psychoanalysis mutates enough, to use a term that that Preciado uses, that it mutates enough to not basically torture queer and trans subjects, and for future generations of queer and trans analysts to not have to go through some of what those of us who are queer or trans identified have had to go through. So we were told to remove these sentences, and in the book we reproduced the entire footnote and highlight what we were asked to remove. And we were not given an explanation. We were then, after we pushed, we were told, well, it's not going to look good for you. We do this to protect you. And we said, you know, some version of like, we've grown up, so we've published before. We're okay with taking that risk.
They told us it looked too political. It would detract from our argument.
Yeah. And we said the paper is political. And actually the award is about a political movement within psychoanalysis to make room for non-normativity in gender and sexuality. But this did not interest the editors. And then it was made clear to us that unless we removed it, they wouldn't publish it. They said to us explicitly, we want the previous version. And it came down to a take it or leave it place. And we complained. We felt that our words were being, that our ideas were being suppressed. And we were met with emails accusing us of slander and defamation. And then all of a sudden, we understood that there were concerns about a lawsuit. And I was actually quite naive, because when we got that email, I said to Anne, what are they going to do, sue us? And Anne said to me, I don't think you understand how British law works. So like, these are concerns. And then it turns out that other people were concerned as well. And it now may begin to sound really bizarre that questions of a lawsuit come up over an academic paper. I mean, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, it sounds pretty strange. Like one might say, there must be more that went on. This can't be the whole story. But that's the whole story. So eventually we said, you know what's fine, like we'll take our paper elsewhere. And then something really strange, even stranger happened. The IJP wrote to the committee, CCing us, but no longer addressing us as if we're children, and said to the committee, we don't have an agreement with the authors. The agreement about publishing the first year CS prize is with you. If these authors publish their paper elsewhere, you, the committee, are going to be in breach of your agreement with us. I mean, the language of a breach of an agreement is legalistic language. It took a while for everybody to understand what was legally true, which was that the paper was ours and we could publish it or not wherever we wanted. And we decided, we were clear, we're not going to edit our paper out. Definitely, we were not going to take out parts about welcoming queer and trans subjects into psychoanalysis. And then we had to decide what we were going to do with the paper. And that's how we approached Jonathan House from the Unconscious in Translation Press. We used La Planche a lot, so it felt like a natural place to publish it. We developed it into a book and we published it. But it's really spectacular. Like it was spectacularly confusing and upsetting to go through this process. And in retrospect, it sounds even more bizarre than it did even for us going through it in real time.
Can I say something, Avgi, which is, I mean, I think many people here today may be aware of this, but I want to flag this for anyone who's not, that it is utterly conventional to include acknowledgements when publishing a book chapter, an essay, in a journal, an entire book. I have edited a book series for more than 20 years now. I've also co-edited academic journals. You never edit someone's acknowledgements. I have never heard of it. I've never done it myself. This is really extraordinary, the intervention that was made at the level of the acknowledgements. So, you know, if we want to think with psychoanalysis, it seems like more is going on here. So that's the first thing to say. The other is that when we got emails basically accusing us of calumny, when we were basically suggesting, like, do you want this to be the reputation the journal has, that you're suppressing work that's critical of homophobia and transphobia? And we get the language of calumny and libel. We know that these are, to me, I actually write about legal issues, that these are red flags, that there may actually be some, this is legal language, that we actually did consult with a lawyer. We consulted with a lawyer based in the UK because we wanted to know, were we actually at risk of a libel charge? And you know, British framing of libel law is very different than the US. It's much more permissive in terms of making libel accusations in the British case. So we consulted with a lawyer. And the fact that we had to consult with a lawyer about the publication of a paper, again, it's really extraordinary. But in some sense, it is in keeping with the moment we're at in psychoanalytic and actually more broadly psychological and psychotherapeutic and psychiatric work with trans kids. Because in the United States, where there are laws effectively criminalizing working with trans children, the state of West Virginia is currently considering a bill that, if passed, would mandate conversion therapy. I mean, so that if you are a psychologist, a mental health counselor, a psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist practicing in the state of West Virginia, or doing remote work from out of state, if you do anything other than cure a child who believes themselves to be trans, of their transness, right? If you do anything other than convert a trans child back into cisness, not only will you be fined $10,000, you are at risk of losing your license, right? So basically, we have medical practitioners, psychotherapeutic practitioners around the United States having to think about the law when they're sitting with patients, right? So the fact that we had to consult with a lawyer to publish this paper, I mean, it's just a little taste of what's happening. And again, and not just in the United States. This was also an interaction with a journal based in Britain, right? This is, so in some sense, what we experienced was shocking for us, but I think in some sense, it might not have been a bad shock. It forced us to do, I think the book is different than the paper would have been. So in that sense, we were pressed to do a different kind of work. We had to respond to this trauma, but we also, I think, ourselves got an even stronger sense of what the stakes are inside and outside psychoanalysis.
Yeah. And one thing that I will add that is actually not in the book is that right after the book came out, a psychoanalyst who works towards what we understand to be conversion practices wrote to us and threatened us with a lawsuit based on the book. Explicitly wrote to us, like the president of SAGAM wrote to me and said that we were going to get sued if we didn't take out this and that from the book. So it's really, this is no joke. This is not just like a theoretical concern. And it is, I'm curious, like, actually about your thoughts about this, Barnaby, when you were talking about resistance.
Well, I thank you. I return to my earlier remark. I didn't really mean to make such a facetious remark as if New York was some enclave of enlightenment, but I do think it is true. I mean, I'm actually getting more convinced that it's true, that I wonder if you really realize how radical it is to question the normativity of gender and suggest that it's based on traumatization. It is mind-blowing for most people, and I wondered if you fully realize that. Now, I salute you for your courage and your perseverance. But on the other hand, when I read the story of how the paper transmuted into a book, I was not the slightest bit surprised that you got absolutely trashy treatment from the International Psychoanalytic Association and the IJP. I would have anticipated trashy treatment from them. The particular committee that manages the Tiresias Award is actually a small minority of psychoanalysts that I think threatens profoundly the majority. And I think, coming from the global South, where we are dominated by European psychoanalysis in the worst possible way, I think this sort of institutional bullying is actually quite to be expected in an organization that has, after all, from the very beginning, been a boys' club. And by and large, a homophobic, transphobic boys' club. So I think what you've done is remarkable. For those who haven't read the book, I would like to actually read the section of the acknowledgement that you were required to take out and I think heroically refused to take out. This is the first of two offending sentences, the ones that were held up as yellow, but I'm going to read them to anyone who hasn't read the book. This project insists on welcoming queer subjects, patients, as well as candidates and analysts who have too often been treated as problems for psychoanalysts rather than as offering opportunities from which to think our metapsychology anew. Wresting such space is not easy nor always pleasant, but it is necessary and critical to psychoanalysis's survival. And I totally think that you were right to say that and to persist in it, even in the face of violent threats, legal and so forth. Now, this brings me, I want to get back to self-theorization before we close, because I think that's a critical area in which I have all sorts of challenging questions for you. But before we go there, I do think your treatment is indicative of something really serious about the state of psychoanalysis. Now, on one of the first pages of your book, you say, yes, psychoanalysis is improving. I don't know that I believe that for the slightest, but you seem to say it. And then remarkably to me, 7 pages later, I actually wrote this down, you say that psychoanalysis, quote, is kept alive in part by metabolizing the tributes of interdisciplinary contact by appropriating them into its own organism. I'm not so clear about your idea that psychoanalysis is improving. I actually, as you may know, I have a theory that in one crucial dimension of its foundation, that things have gone downhill since 1915, and Andre Green sort of agreed with me on that point. But you also, later in the book, at the end, you say, and I wrote this down as well, as you say, a psychoanalysis, quote unquote, a psychoanalysis that becomes hegemonic and legislative is not a psychoanalysis worth having. And I think this is a very, very serious matter, because ultimately you have strong forces within the institutions of psychoanalysis that are in fact anti-psychoanalytic in several senses of the word. And I really am not optimistic, and particularly when we see in South Africa the treatment that we have received from the International Psychoanalytic Association, irregardless of the fact that we won the Sigourney Award, supposedly. I think I really want to ask you about this optimism, because I foresee a future in which real psychoanalysts, which I will say I believe is the 4 of us, cannot really operate within institutions that are becoming barbarically oppressive. There, I've said my piece.
I love that comment so much, and I'm sure Anne will have a lot to say as well. But let me take a stab at it first. I want to start by saying, I stand here as somebody who has resigned from 2 professional organizations in the last year, from the American Psychoanalytic Organization for its hypocrisy in addressing racism, but treating racialized analysts really shittily, to kind of like, since we're talking so directly, and from the White Institute for the ways in which they did the same thing around a colleague who is active in thinking about Palestine, but that's not something that is welcome these days in psychoanalytic institutions. So I'm totally with you. For me, the hopefulness comes precisely from the fact that perhaps we will come to see that institutions is not where it's at. Perhaps we have to stop fantasizing that there will be a good enough parent or a good enough family that will host us, that will welcome us, that will give us the tools to thrive, and to actually disinvest from organizations. Just like, when we were thinking about the IJP, we really struggled. We didn't want to edit our paper, and we knew that we wouldn't. But many of our colleagues who we trust, said to us, but think about it, like the IJP reaches so many people. What would it mean for people who would never come into contact with a paper like this to have access to it? So we didn't say no to that out of some kind of like, like haughty, selfish, kind of like, who are they to tell us what to do place. We did it because we felt that even though there was something to give up, it is much more important for us to stop compromising, not just us, but all of us as analysts, so that we can be included, so that we can be published, so that we can, just yesterday, I refused to go to the American Psychoanalytic Association's meeting to receive my own award. Like, we need to be able to disinvest, and we need to risk losing things. So what I'm hopeful about is about seeing, especially in generations that are coming after us, a diminished willingness to be mistreated and to be abused by our profession for the purpose of inclusivity. And we still got our book published. And, like some of us have resigned from organizations, and we're still alive and working and giving talks and participating in conversations. That's what makes me feel optimistic. That's a version of psychoanalysis, not all of psychoanalysis, definitely not institutional psychoanalysis. And we need to be willing to put our commitments to what we believe in. If we think in a radical way, that's going to cost us, and that's going to have to be okay enough.
Yeah, no, I'm actually really, I'm so appreciative of what you said, Barnaby. And, I'm also thinking about, some of the improvements. Psychoanalysis is improving, and it's not improving enough, to be sure. And this is the ways in which those improvements can quickly get sedimented and institutionalized in ways that utterly defang what should be, what actually, in some sense, threatens psychoanalysis or shakes it up. So it has to be undone, like including like rethinking our metapsychologies. The improvements would be, for example, I'm genderqueer. I'm a licensed psychoanalyst in the state of New York. Like, there are people that couldn't even have been allowed to train within psychoanalytic institutes, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And that's happening begrudgingly. And it also really depends upon where you're located nationally, which institute we're talking about, right? But so there's some more people welcomed into psychoanalysis, but like how big that welcome is, we see how it shrinks, there's like representational at the level of the body, at the level of the identity of the person. That doesn't mean that the ideas or how psychoanalysis practices becomes as wide as the people whom psychoanalysis says it's claiming. There's a kind of an attempt to think about the ways in which psychoanalysis is entangled in whiteness, but how far that goes. I mean, so again, these are improvements, but they haven't gone far enough. And I think that there can be too much self-congratulation about such improvements as has happened. And again, I'm going to use the word metapsychology. We have to basically rethink the foundations of psychoanalysis if we're actually going to think about and work with the differences that have been in the room with us for a long, long time, and in our institutes and in the wider social field. The psychoanalytic concepts we draw on cannot remain the same. And we can have a separate conversation about like in some of the fundamental offerings of psychoanalysis, whether it's the conception of the unconscious or the drive, or I know this is something you thought about a lot, Barnaby, free association. In some sense, a lot of psychoanalysis has abandoned precisely what would enable it to be so radical, right? And including to radically, think about the questions of the political and often painful incommensurabilities between the political and the psychical. So, we want psychoanalysis to get bigger and bigger and bigger, more expansive, more capacious, and that might mean actually a radical deinstitutionalization, ultimately, of psychoanalysis and its project, because our institutions are conservative, lowercase c conservative, right? That's what institutions do. They conserve themselves. They preserve themselves.
And we help with that when we remain complicit, when we see terrible things happening. I mean, so many of us are in abusive relationships with psychoanalytic institutions, and we stay in them. And I think we really need to give some very careful thought about that. Like in my institute, we were told we cannot use the word genocide on our listserv. I mean, I don't know what to call that if not censorship. No, these are really serious problems. And for us, if you're going to do if you're going to be thinking radically about psychoanalysis with the unconscious as a force and an energy, as you and I were talking about last time, Barnaby, if you're going to think about psychoanalytic praxis as not being developmentalist, but as really having to do with improvisational, and that will get us to the discussion you wanted to have about self-theorization and the experimental, it means that kind of like we are back to thinking back, or in a spiral way, moving towards thinking about a psychoanalysis that deserves its name, because it has the potential to actually disturb our institutions and also us. And that's where psychoanalysis is at its best. And this is what I think we are also collectively resisting by staying in these abusive relationships, because we're also frightened. Psychoanalysis, I think, is an incredibly powerful force. Like, it's a way of thinking and being that upends so much, and it puts everything, it makes everything. I was having a conversation with Dominique Scarfoni about this in his last book, when he was talking about how kind of like when you look at some concepts again, the concepts start to blink, they become more unsteadied, and then you kind of get to look at them again and think about what we will do with them again. Things beginning to blink frighten us, but it's also exciting. Things beginning to blink, concepts beginning to blink, is also what makes psychoanalysis alive. So perhaps this is a slide to talking about self-theorization. Did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say one more thing, which is about the, staying in institutions that are in some ways just actually doing violences with which we then become complicit. I think it's sometimes we get frightened, like both at what will we be giving up if we step away, and then what will we step away into, right? I don't want to minimize those, but I want to go to the issue of what we're willing to give up, because those of us who say we're committed to particular, social justice projects have to be willing to give things up. I mean, Avgi's talked about, leaving APSA and leaving the White Institute, where she was faculty for a long time. I gave up a speaking invitation at White, and I did so because of my profound concern about the treatment of a colleague and the cancellation of a panel that was not even on Palestine, but because of one speaker's sort of commitment, public commitment to defending Palestine. And that's deeply concerning to me when I see what's happening in the larger landscape around academic freedom in the United States, not just within psychoanalysis. So, like, what are we willing to give up? And, I'm realizing I also say this from a position of privilege, being in North America. I have a full-time job as a professor. And so, like, if I give up a speaking gig, oh, well, I'll have other ones. But I think we have to be willing to lose things in order to have more. Even if we don't know yet, we haven't yet imagined what that more will be. I think we're not allowing ourselves to even to want more sometimes.
But I was thinking it's such a repetition, isn't it, what played out? So there's this point where, especially with your book, Sexuality Beyond Consent. So there's a point where the organization has got something that disrupts it. And there's this possibility of something coming in, something new coming in. But it's almost like going back to when you were talking about whiteness in the book and sort of male gender sort of identity. It's very difficult for it to get disrupted. So it's not just a mouthing, talking about lip service thing, but to have an experience of having to question it. And then, like with your book, that's also something that is enigmatically taken in and questioned and realized that happens. So it's an interesting repetition.
The question is to act, because as psychoanalysts we are so for important reasons, but also for reasons that sometimes limit us. As psychoanalysts, we're so committed to the category of thinking versus action. And I think that is a false divide, because of course we also act all the time. There's just some action that is deemed as not action because it's not politicized in the same way, or it doesn't go towards directions that disturb the status quo. And what you're saying about repetition is right on. The distinction, I would say, returning to our conversation from last time, between repetition compulsion and a repetition that can actually spin into something into something different. But I do also want to go to Barnaby's important question about self-theorization, because it's so key. And I was wondering, Barnaby, if you wanted to share a bit about your reservations about it, so we can have a way of entering this dialogue.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because we did talk about this last time, we touched on it. The whole idea of repetition compulsion that stultifies and fixates, essentially, versus what Gilles Deleuze talked about, repetition with a difference. And it's interesting because in a way, we're all of us talking about that in relation to institutions. As you just said, Anne, you're caught between, it's sort of like a rehearsal of Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution. It's like you're caught between, if you participate in these institutions, then you get appropriated. And if you don't participate in these institutions, then you disappear without a trace into the ether, which I think is actually the situation that a lot of us who want to rethink psychoanalysis is the situation we're in. But I want to go, if we can, to this, I mean, because the book is worth reading and rereading, and it challenges, I think, every analyst on the level of what difference does this make? What difference is this going to make as I sit with my patients, and even more importantly, as I sit with myself? And I think I did not, I mean, I know you discussed extensively in the first hour the clinical case that you present, which I think was beautifully illustrative of some of the points you're making, but does not necessarily provide a takeaway in terms of what does your theory do for us when we on Monday morning go back into the method of sitting with our patients. Now, you say that what we do is we treat, a word which you put in inverted commas, we all treat trauma, including and perhaps first and foremost, this traumatization around gender. We treat trauma by self-theorization. It left me very confused. First of all, what self are we talking about? And I know you have a riff, I think it's in the other book actually, on self-sovereignty in Bataille's sense. And Georges Bataille, I think, is an important element here. So what self are we talking about? And then when the self has theorized itself, you're very clear that this is not a conscious process, which raises the question, which I think is germane to psychoanalytic method. Does that mean that this self-theorization is actually in a representable form? And that's crucial, because if it's not in a representable form, you do something very different for it. And similarly, by the same token, is it susceptible to self-reflectivity? And I was left a little bit confused by that. Now, maybe I've only read the book once, so it may be that my confusion will get cleared up on a second reading, but I was left with that. And to me, it segues with what I view as an overuse of Laplanche, because I think Laplanche has problems that have not yet really been explicated in the literature, one of which is that he, like Dominique Scarfone following him, overemphasizes the epistemic in relation to the ontological, which I think you do quite consistently in several places in the book. And I really have a question about that, because again, going back to Georges Bataille and then Gilles Deleuze as an heir of Bataille's thinking, you think about Gilles Deleuze talk about the plane of immanence. And in a way, the plane of immanence seems to be exactly what you're talking about, but thinking of it in that way relocates you in a whole tradition of philosophy, a subterranean, countercultural to a tradition of Western philosophy that Elizabeth Gross, for instance, wrote about, which emphasizes something ontological as a being-becoming process without it appearing, as I think it does appear at crucial stages in your book, as if something about knowing and representation is the motor of it. I've got two different sorts of worry embedded in what I've just said.
I really love this question. It brings up so much. Do you want to go first, or should I? What do you want?
I just want to say, I mean, I think I love that you brought up Deleuze and the plane of immanence. I mean, I think that, you know, what we're arguing about becoming and even the unfolding of gender. I mean, we think about the unfolding in relationship to the Deleuzean and the folds that Deleuze and Guattari speak about. But I mean, this is absolutely, you know, about, you know, to think about change over time as not, but not as about an ontological unfolding, even as something can develop the consistency such that I think that there's a self-theorization that is something that we've come to call like the queer agency of the unconscious. There's a self-theorization, and I'm dying to hear what Avgi will say about this, because I love this question: is it formulated, formulable, or not? So we could call a self-theorization that's actually not formulated, but as it takes that, but insofar as it becomes formulated, in some sense, that's gender. Right? Gender may be one of the results, or whatever that gender is, of that self-theorization. Gender, as it becomes representable, and itself can shapeshift as sort of things shift, sort of underground, so to speak. But I'm very excited with the Deleuzean links you're making. I mean, I'm having just been reading and teaching Spinoza's A Practical Philosophy with graduate students this past week. So that's, yeah, it rhymes. It really rhymes. My colleague Andre Lepecki has been teaching me Deleuze, so I thank him for that.
This question, I think, I'm really fascinated by this question, Barnaby, and I have a couple of different thoughts about it. The one is, as you may know, like, I really love Bataille, and I really love his very deep and serious and uncompromising commitment to the non-utile and to not getting caught up in projects that eventually and inevitably become capitalist projects, become kind of like products of neoliberal governance. Here's where this comes in. I think that self-theorization, obviously what you're pointing out about the question of the self, like we could say, who's the self? That's the theorizing of the self, and what is that agency that produces the agency that it ostensibly already has in order to be able to do the production. I think that's kind of like, that's a mirror in the mirror problem that I don't think I can answer in a satisfactory way. But I will say this, I think that self-theorization does trade on representability, in the sense that one theorizes oneself in a way that is contingent, historically contingent. It is of the moment. It has to do with whatever psychic materials are available right now, and stitches together an understanding or a version of a self that is livable right now. By livable, I don't mean that it is a good life or livable for others, but one that feels like, for example, if we take Ori in our theorization takes materials from the mythosymbolic of gender and what gender is, male, female, how that's inflected through anti-Semitism, how that's inflected through Judaism, and also maternal trauma and how that's threaded through these materials, to concoct a version of their gender that we never give a name to and that may never have a name. And that we are passionate about helping analysts think about defending that. Like, one of the things that we say in the book is that the patient's self-theorization may or not take, but it's the analyst's job to help defend it. And what we mean by defend it here is not to treat it as a final outcome, but then the patient needs to coil their defenses around or coil their life around, but to give the experiment a shot. That's what we mean by that. Such that it's, I think, and this will go to immanence and Bataille, it's only when you can give an experiment a shot and you can try to give it the consistency of identity that you have a chance for it to fall apart. If you're fighting for your gender to be recognized, you don't get to be at a place where you can actually let it go. where you can let it go in a way that it can reveal something else to you. So I don't mean this in a sequential way that it sounds, but there is a way in which our resisting our patients' genders. Let's take cisgender actually and go to the example that you brought. We take our cis patients' genders as given, and therefore our patients never get to undo their genders. I'm not talking here about converting cis people. I'm talking about the severe limitation that comes with us taking that so for granted that it never becomes a point of inquiry. And that is kind of like, it's harder. Like if you want to talk about immanence, you want to talk about the sexual and the ways in which Bataille talks about expenditure and dépens. Like you're not going to get to dépens. You're not going to get to this kind of effervescence through anything that feels settled. But without something feeling settled enough, you're going to be fighting for its recognition. So I think that there's this gentle dance and delicate dance between not creating environments where subjects double down on their identity. And I think that one way that we could do this as analysts is actually granting it so that we can move with it and through it, rather than having the patient try to prove it to us or us taking it as for granted. Like I have patients that I see in analytic treatments, sort of like who are trans-identified, whose gender has mutated several times during the course of the analysis, from one version of trans to another version of non-binary, to a consideration of something that's cis-looking. And that mutation feels more interesting to me than just, and that has happened because there's room for holding all of these. I hope that this touches on some of the, I'm curious what you'll think about this.
I wonder if I could say one thing in response to what Avi just said, because I love this line of questioning that you've opened up, Barnaby, that we could think of, again, this queer agency of the unconscious, this self-theorization. We're not referring to a volitional process, right? So something is happening unconsciously, but as it gets formulated into gender, and also multiple forms of gender embodiment beyond the binary, and as these become legible to the emerging subject of gender and to the larger social field, then it can start to develop something that becomes conscious, but not in the sense that I consciously chose to become this, even if that might start to be vocabulary someone uses. That's a totally legitimate vocabulary if someone uses this of their gender. But we're talking about something which after the fact starts to feel like one's own, even if there was a contingency to its having arrived here, where this here might be just, it might become another here later on, right? The radical contingency, which after the fact starts to feel like one's own, perhaps a one's own that I was born this way. Maybe that's the metaphor through which one describes that feeling of it feels right to me. So it's like we want to, again, think both at once. Something can, after the fact, come to be consciously articulated, even if that doesn't mean it was a conscious process. And I think you're right to say that, that self-theorization is a slippery term because it introduces all sorts of sort of features of thinking, such as an authentic self or volition when we don't mean them. And this is, something that we want to become more clearly able to articulate ourselves.
Yeah, I think you need to write another book on that, just this point. If I can just be prescriptive for a moment, because it is actually a crucial point, I think, and it's crucial in terms precisely, Avgi, as you just, in terms of maintaining the sense of the fluidity of gender. And it's too easy to slip into thinking self-theorization is something volitional, or there's an agential self that's involved in it, or it's theorization in the sense that cognitive dissonance theory is the theory. It's an articulatable position, because in a way it's not. And it's interesting, Anne, you talk about authenticity. There's some way that you say, let me get this right, there's nothing authentic about gender other than our experience of it. And I was left thinking, you really didn't mean to write that, did you? Because I mean, first of all, you think about Adorno's critique of authenticity and the jargon of authenticity. And I started thinking to myself, maybe the beauty and the terror of psychoanalysis is that in a way there is no such thing as authentic experience. But maybe you disagree.
You know, it's an interesting question, because as oftentimes, you know, you hear somebody quote a sentence from your book and you're like, I wouldn't write it like this now. And you know, it's true that there's something about the implication of that. Yeah, too late.
Too late.
It's always too, but that's also the beauty of it. That's why new books are needed, right? And I love that every time we meet, you assign new writing new books for me to write. I think it's like really delightful. But you know, when I think that what I'm not going to speak for us, like, because we haven't discussed this, I'm going to speak for myself. I think that what I meant with that sentence was not that there's something authentic about experience, but all we have about gender is one's experience of it. But it is oddly phrased, for sure.
No, I sort of guessed that was what was meant, but it's like one of those moments where you stumble because it's as if we all slide back into language that we didn't quite intend, because we're trying to say something that is slightly more off-key than the usual meaning of the terms. You and I had a discussion about this last time, about sliding into energy talk, which I'm very fond of, but which in a way, the whole post-Lacanian, post-Laplanchian mode of thinking has illegitimized.
I mean, at the key of that sentence is a question of like, what if we took experience seriously, but not on its word? Kind of like, you know, I think the question of experience interests me greatly, and not the experience of one, not in the sense of like, I experience myself as a woman, or I experience myself as a white person, or I experience myself as gay, but like kind of like the enlargement of experience. And, you know, I'm thinking of Benjamin's notion of kind of like, you know, that we have grown poor in experience. And I think that, no, I just wish that as psychoanalysts we would read more philosophy. No, that's the other interlocutor that we constantly miss, and which, you know, philosophy is actually not very friendly to identity or interested in the propping up of the ego in the same way, at least some of the philosophers that we've mentioned today.
Yeah, and I'm thinking this, I mean, this maybe goes to something, you know, again, this question of philosophy, whom are psychoanalysts reading? What are they drawing on? And I know that you actually richly engaging with philosophic traditions in your own work, Barnaby. And I'm thinking about, and that there's a version of a transcendental subject of consciousness that psychoanalysis works with, but we've displaced, in some sense, we've taken it inside, right? So it can be versions of the kind of endogenous unconscious. So that even though it's no longer out there, again, it's just transcends and set up within. And that could produce sense of authenticity as, well, it was, you know, there's a core, right? It emerged from this core, or you went, or it moved towards a core. But either way, again, this sort of like, again, this strange sort of interior transcendental subject of consciousness. And that version of authenticity, you know, we definitely would not sign on to. But the word authentic and the word authenticity are culturally available. And I think they become some of the, let's say, codes with which someone will come to explain or sort of come to describe a gender that feels good enough for themselves, that is like has been a good, you know, sort of ongoing fit. And we are, you know, even as we might put pressure authenticity, we absolutely would not invalidate anyone's self-description as feeling their gender to be authentic.
Yeah, we look here, we've got about 5 minutes.
Can I add something to this, Michael?
Yeah.
You know, Anne was saying we wouldn't invalidate. And it's true, like, I too would never say to somebody, you think that your gender is X, but it's Y. And of course, no analyst in the right mind would say it like this, but there are many ways in which that stance is conveyed. But what I would want is space for the patient to be curious, not at my command or timing or investment about the claim of their gender. And many people, trans people included, like, become curious about that when they don't have to fight their analyst and fight the state for recognition. And that, I think, is a process that process involves a certain degree of seduction. And that's something we talked about last time, Barnaby, but not seduction in the sense of trickery, but it's a process that has to do with the animating forces of the libidinal in the encounter with the analyst. I think that connects with immanence. I'm curious what you think about this.
I'm actually not sure what I think about it. Not immediately. I mean, there is something questionable about saying we would never invalidate anyone's sense of their own gender, because in a certain sense, maybe not invalidate, but you have effectively and powerfully called into question the identity of everyone who says, I'm this and that's that.
For sure, but there's a difference between calling it metapsychologically in question and then addressing in the analytic situation with the power of the analyst's authority a singular person and saying your gender.
Yeah. Obviously, I mean, I totally agree with that. But it touches on the question that we've been repeatedly touching on, which is sort of what is the socio-political position that we are in as analysts, and as analysts who take these radical sort of theorizations seriously, as opposed to analysts who go through the trade school and come out as self-psychologists or whatever.
The trade school.
That's what they are, unfortunately. Sadly.
A very quotable line. Very quotable line.
I mean, in a way, the trade school mentality has in a way bankrupted psychoanalysis at the institutional level.
Yeah. That's why I was actually surprised with your question of, like, what is the analyst who reads your book left to do with it on Monday morning when they go see their patients? Because my answer to that is they should figure that out on their own.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Of course.
Okay, that we've I've posted a link for the book in the chat, so everyone can click on the link, and I'll if people missed it, they just message and I can send a link to them. But
and can I just also let everyone here know that there will be an ebook. There's an ebook coming out later this spring, probably in May, from New York University Press, and we mentioned that because we know that accessing books is complicated as they have to move through the mail. So we're very excited that the ebook will be available at the end of the spring.
That is wonderful news, because I've been contacted by people in South Africa saying they're struggling to get hold of the book, and they even wanted me to contact you to see if there's a way they could do a mass order. So the ebook would be brilliant, and then
That's an ebook of this book.
Yes, an ebook of this version
we still want the ebook on self-theorization.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll get on that. Like once we're done with the conversations today.
And Michael, if anybody wants help getting the actual hard copy book, please email us as a group or individually, and we'll help people figure it out.
Yeah, you can find me at annpellegrini.com as well. We're very happy to help facilitate your getting a hold of the hard copy of the book.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you and thank you guys very much. It's been a wonderful debate and discussion, and I'm pleased we got time to get into it with the three of you. And
speaking as Charlene, I'd like to apologize again for my absence the first hour. But I also want to thank the two of you for the courageous stance you're taking. And we do need the next book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barnaby. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
everyone
both.
for being here.
Yes.
What a pleasure. Thank you.